We're very happy this evening to have with us Miss Melissa Burch and My Journey Through War and Peace. Melissa Burch has worked as a filmmaker for CBS and the BBC. She was featured in the New York Times, produced a national public television series, co-hosted a radio show on Voice America, and has been a spiritual seeker for over 30 years. My Journey Through War and Peace describes her adventures in war zones in Afghanistan and the Soviet Union and her peace efforts during the Cold War, as well as her inward spiritual journey. She was the executive producer of Women in Limbo Presents, a national public television series about women's lives, and served as president of the New York Film Video Council. She's also a homeopath, co-founder of the Catalyst School of Homeopathy, and produced and hosted one of the first successful radio shows on Voice America on homeopathy. Please give her a warm Books and Books welcome, Miss Melissa Burch.
It's so great to be here. It's my first time in Miami, and we've been staying. We got an RV. I don't know if any of you've seen that. We're calling her Gaia. So she's traveling all over the country right now. This is our 9th city. And so we've been everywhere. We started in our kind of hometown area of Cambridge, and we made our way down through Washington, D.C., New York, Philadelphia, and then our last stop was Nashville, and we're all the way over here. And so it's been an amazing experience, you know, really intimate groups, which I actually kind of like because the dialogues have been really very heartfelt and really sort of on the theme of the heroine's journey. And it's funny because yesterday we've been in an RV park over the lake, and the weather here actually, until the kind of major humidity stepped in, we were like, oh my God, this reminds us of Greece, and my husband's Greek, and we have a tiny house there. So that breeze and that sort of kind of open, fresh air was just, we were so glad to have gotten out of Cambridge, you know, with that last storm. So really excited to be here. And also, it's funny, I was just in the women's bathroom, and it had a sign that said, you know, what is the meaning of dinosaurs? You know, why are they here? And, you know, they came and left. And yesterday there was this large egret that I guess you guys have them around. They're just spectacular. And I was wondering, like, what's the meaning of that egret sort of coming in? And I'm one of those that sort of Googles the totem animals. I don't know if you guys do that. So this idea of, like, where do messages come from? Like, you know, yes, we have our everyday life and sort of what matters, and we're paying attention. But sometimes there's these surprises, like this egret just was so tall and kind of just moseying along. And so I kind of Googled it to sort of like see, you know, was there something in it? And I said adamantly self-determination, which I feel like, okay, you know, that's where I'm heading, you know, like, okay, what is it that I can kind of manage to do on this journey? And then I thought, okay, that's really kind of funny to see the dinosaur message, you know, of like, okay, why are the dinosaurs here? So I think that's really what I'm kind of interested in, having these, you know, much more intimate settings where we get a chance to actually kind of talk, because everything happens so often in the digital world, and we don't get to really be people in a room, you know, like this is actually kind of rare, you know, especially for me, you know, in that sense of being out of town and with new, you know, new experiences. And what I'm looking at around the heroine's journey is, yes, we all have heard, probably most of us, of the hero's journey of Joseph Campbell, of going out there and sort of kind of, you know, tackling the monsters and the difficulties and kind of getting from A to B and having all our adventures. And the heroine's journey for me is like, what is the sort of values? What's the meaning behind that? Like, how are we taking that journey? What are our relationships like? Are we paying attention to how we are with our, you know, the people closest to us? Are we really intimate in those dialogues? How are we showing up around, you know, just the world around us, or the environment that we have some, you know, kind of control over, in a sense? Like, are we really paying attention? Like, one of these talks I did, someone was talking about her heroine's journey was, you know, she was looking at the fact that she was living in New York City, you know, so in one of those kind of high rises, and the apartment next to her was putting down some kind of toxic fumes. And she's like, you know, she brought out the, you know, the filters and the fans. And, you know, it was like, for her, paying attention to, you know, how does she take care of her environment around her? And then looking in, like, what are we aware of? You know, are we really conscious of what matters for us? And in that way, going out, you know, with that kind of consciousness, then we see that, you know, the heroine's journey is not just about women, and, you know, it's not gender-based. It's more about, okay, let's integrate these two almost like DNA strands, right? Of, this outward journey, which I think many of us women are actually very successful at. Like we don't have issues of sort of getting organized and reaching our goals and all that. And then also for men to start to look at, okay, what is that sort of intimate, personal way of how we're doing this? And both of us coming together around how do we integrate sort of the male principles and the feminine principles. And when I wrote this memoir, I never intended to write a memoir. Like I never even thought of myself as a writer in that sense. And it was when I was turning 50, I was looking back at all the stories in my memories and starting to see the themes. And I saw myself at 20, I turned 21 on the border in Afghanistan. And I was so male-directed. It was that generation of feminism. My mother was sort of the first generation. I was kind of this, well, actually the first of that labeling of feminism. There were obviously many other generations before her. But I was coming in as the second generation where the feeling was I could do anything that a man could do. So I took it to the extreme, right? I went into Afghanistan in a war zone as a journalist, being this kind of tough guy with all that kind of resolve that I could do this. But inside, I was really an anxious person. People say, well, how could you be that courageous and go into a war zone? But I didn't feel courageous. Actually, I grew up in a family where my mother was an alcoholic. There was a lot of rage. And so I had a lot of that kind of angst in me. And being a homeopath, are there any homeopaths in the room? Or any, yes? Oh, so it's funny, on this journey I'm meeting again homeopaths. And so homeopathy is an alternative or holistic practice, and one of our principles in homeopathy is the idea of like cures like. So someone's like, you did a homeopathic journey because here I was feeling anxious growing up in that kind of a household with my mother, and I go into probably the most anxious, fearful kind of situation. And so in that process, it was a healing journey. And it's totally counterintuitive, right? I mean, one doesn't think that a nervous, anxious, fearful person, put them in a war zone and that would actually heal them, right? But if from a homeopathic viewpoint, looking back with that understanding as a homeopath, I think it was a healing in that sense of just kind of heightening it up, like increasing the intensity of a situation. And also I think what happened, and the piece I'm going to read is from that, it came right after I had filmed this attack on a Soviet convoy. I was feeling like, okay, I had done my job. I was going to deliver the footage to Dan Rather at CBS, and I was feeling good, like, okay, I'm on my way out. And at the same time, that was a moment of kind of turning for me. So I think these journeys of the sort of male and feminine principles are always existing, coexisting. And it was really through writing the memoir and connecting those memories that I could see the connection. So it's a very short piece, so I'm going to go ahead and start reading that, and then we'll see what that brings up for you. And so just to kind of place it, this is during the Soviet invasion. So it's over 30 years ago, so it's a long time ago. Unfortunately, I mean, things have changed there, of course, but the war has continued. I mean, now, of course, we're responsible for a lot of the horrors there, actually. And I'm on my way out. Commander Razik wanted to take a shortcut on the Kandahar-Herat highway, where the Soviet caravan had been attacked a few weeks ago. It was a direct route to take me across the Pakistani border. We passed the broken storehouses that were bombed in the ambush I had shot earlier in the month. The paved road felt open, vulnerable, and too quiet on this early afternoon. The sun was falling behind the distant hills with pinkish-orange clouds in the sky. Razik pulled the trucks off the road for the mujahideen to pray. Back on the paved road, dark shadows covered the large rock formations in the distance. I was listening to the rumble of the truck, the speedometer climbing to 60 kilometers per hour on the flat road. We were moving at a steady pace, nearly reaching the rocks before the mountains ahead. Then Razik stopped again. Something snapped in me, some kind of intuition, a demand from a higher sense of awareness, urged me to follow through, even though it made no sense. I felt like a maniac as I yelled over and over, "I want to be home for Christmas." The Afghans had no idea what I was screaming about, nor did I. Sure, Christmas was 7 days away, and I wanted to be home for Christmas. Some of my best memories were opening presents around the Christmas tree. But my family was dispersed now, and there really wasn't a home to go home to for the holidays. I wanted to bring Dan Rather the footage on time, too, and I knew it would be close. It was at least 5 days from the Afghanistan border to D.C. if I caught every flight on time and there were no delays. But really? The 5 tall, bearded, muscular mujahideen, who could have been brothers, looked up at me like from their kneeling positions, frozen, perhaps wondering if I was possessed. My words were having no impact. Christmas? Home? The most rugged of the men recited his prayers in the familiar whisper, bowing to Allah. I shoved him full force. I kept pushing him towards the truck. Razik and the other men followed. They stopped mid-prayer and drove off. My breath, normal again, was deep and relaxed. I was almost giddy during the smooth ride on the paved road out of Afghanistan. When we got close to the Pakistan border, 4 shadows in the distance walked towards the trucks. These Afghani mujahideen recognized us and started running, shouting, "Wadaraja, stop!" We pulled over again. All of the men jumped out of the trucks. I followed. Talking fast and with wild gesticulations, all 9 men turned to face me. One stranger pointed at me. More talking as though I had stumbled into a foreign movie with no subtitles. Something big had happened. I just didn't know what. Then one of the brothers kneeled on the ground and prayed in my direction like I was Mecca. Now I really had no idea what was going on. Another mujahideen copied the first one. Soon the gang was honoring me. Eventually, I realized what had happened. The mujahideen who had stopped us had just mined the road, not expecting any comrades to drive through at night. Had we arrived a few minutes later, we would have all been blown up. My intuition and outrageous action had saved us. Strangely, I didn't feel attached to life or death, but I felt protected, driven by an invisible force. Nothing made sense. This journey into war in Afghanistan could have been a death fall, but the experiences I was going through made me feel energized and unbreakable. And it really, for like going back and looking at these memories, these are stories I had told, many times to family and friends. And it was seeing that time, that I think, the adrenaline going and the sort of hyper awareness opened up some kind of channel that allowed me to survive. And that coming into my body so directly in a way I could trust it. Like I know, I think most of us, our emotions, we're understanding them. They're very valuable. We need to know how they navigate, but not so trustworthy, really. And same with our minds. Oftentimes our minds can construct all kinds of ideas of what is and isn't. And again, not as trustworthy as that direct kind of, corporal experience, like in the body. And when I went back to look at that, I saw that was a moment in my life where it registered. So when something that didn't make sense or seemed totally out of context, and I had that sensation in my body, I could trust it. And I think then, again, that's the heroine's journey. How do we bring intuition in a way into our lives where the culture out there doesn't recognize it, doesn't validate it, And yet we know that when we understand that part of ourselves where we have a calling or a need or a desire, and oftentimes our friends and families aren't supportive, like, what the heck are you thinking about? Like, really? But we know inside of us we have to take that step. And it doesn't mean it's easy, right? I mean, it doesn't mean that it's this, I think sometimes people just talk about the flow or everything just kind of works out, but that's not been my experience. In fact, I think when you're really living that kind of heroine's journey, and I'm putting the emphasis on heroine because it's so not in our awareness, because in a way it still is the hero's journey, and both are woven together. And calling attention to that, sort of much more conscious about the things that, the messiness of life. Like, what does it take to really guide us? And so what I want to do is read the other aspect of this journey that happened, where being a woman in Afghanistan, I had access to the women, which the male journalists didn't have. And at that time, there were so few journalists crossing over the border, because for the Western world, you couldn't get in through the Soviet channels except for very limited access, which is our current way of film, doing or allowing journalists in for filming wars is very limited. And so there were very few journalists crossing in through and getting embedded with the Mujahideen, and it took months, and it was a way for some journalists to break in. Very dangerous way to break into the business, but was what I did. So this part that I'm going to read, again, a short piece, happened before the getting out or trying to exit out of Afghanistan. And it was after the attack too, so both things this happened in between. Behind the curtained doorway, rustling sounds caught my attention. An angel-faced teenage girl entered like a ballerina. She tiptoed over to me, took my hand, and pulled me up to float off stage into the secret women's quarters. In a second, smaller living room, the remains of the women's segregated feast were littered on another dark red Afghani rug. An old woman grinned a toothless smile and patted the pillow next to her for me to sit. More sweet tea was served with store-bought almond cookies on French china. I was full but could not refuse this graciousness. 10 women of all ages, from teens to 70s, their faces framed in colorful scarves, circled me. This reminded me of the women's empowerment groups I'd seen in my youth, where the next exercise, falling backwards into their arms, was meant to teach me to trust them. The leader of the group, a woman my mother's age, wearing a bulky tribal silver lapis lazuli necklace, pushed forward and kindly wrapped a floral scarf around my unwashed hair and my face like a veil. A dark-haired toddler wrapped in her auntie's arms reached out and touched my greasy hair. The ballerina girl then escorted me up a rickety wooden staircase that led me to the second floor. The dusk-lit attic room was completely bare, except for 2 large aluminum metal basins. Women brought large blackened kettles and poured cleansing hot water into the tubs. My ballerina friend ceremoniously removed the veil and lifted my stained tunic over my head. I removed my filthy pants, bra, and panties in a trance-like state and then stepped into the steamy bath. My curves and nakedness exposed to admirers. The Afghan aunties fussed over me, dipping a soft cloth into the divine water that smelled of rose petals and removing layers of grime and dirt from my travels with the Mujahideen. The auntie who gave me the scarf opened a sweet-smelling bottle of Clairol shampoo and washed my hair. Silently, she poured pitchers of hot water over me in a matriarchal baptism of women honoring women. This harem rite, fit for a queen, was my Afghan legacy from ancient Islamic times. 24 hours was all the time we would spend in this oasis. I felt comfortable traveling with the Mujahideen. They were becoming my friends. But with a circle of women, I could be myself, fragile, vulnerable, and this gave me more strength to go back into the men's world. So, I mean, as someone who had a lot of body image, you know, going in there, how these women from their culture created such a safe space that I felt nurtured and protected. And again, you know, when writing a memoir is like going and connecting those pieces of, wow, that was a direct encounter with the feminine and with that kind of support, which I didn't have growing up. Or again, I don't think that's part of our culture. That kind of touching is not something that we, you know, that we experience other than in more kind of sexual relationships or other, but that, you know, who gets bathed, you know, like that. And yet it felt so, it was so healing. And at the time I felt it, of course, just being in the travels, but now looking back, seeing that kind of set a trajectory around looking for that and sort of recognizing the importance of touch and that feminine way of nurturing. So I sort of, this is the point where I kind of sometimes put you guys on a hot seat because it's been so interesting, the dialogues around, you know, where are you in the heroine's journey? Like, where is the resistance? Where do you feel in the flow in that sort of definition of how are you kind of embodying this sort of going out and reaching your goals, which I call kind of more the hero or the male principles, and then still honoring the feminine principles in yourself? Yeah, great.
A little bit on that. What do you mean by making a distinction between the male principle and the female principle?
That's a great. So the questions around the male principle, defining the two, the male principle and the feminine principle. And so one of the ways, I mean, in this book, I used a lot of Jungian ideas that have the anima and the animus. So that was the way he defined it. And there are many other traditions that bring in this idea of male and feminine energy. And again, it's not gender-based. It doesn't mean that, you know, we really want the integration of both. So it's not like a woman full, you know, as we see with Hillary Clinton right now, right? I mean, there's a lot of that male energy. So for me, the male energy is really that directed outward of reaching goals, of looking at things in a much more outward strategic way and using the mind more than the heart. Yes. Right. And we need this. It's not to say it's not, it's very important. I mean, it's not in any way to discredit it. It's extremely valuable, especially in our modern culture. And then the feminine is looking more at the heart, right? And more of the intuitive and more going into the subconscious and more not as linear. It tends to cycle. We revisit things over and over. So we see the circles and the transformation. A lot of times in our culture, we may focus on birth and death as kind of like a linear, like, you know, you're born and then you die. But in fact, when we start to see the integration of the feminine, there's a lot of time spent in the kind of composting, you know, the real sort of underground subconscious where things arise out that we may not have been consciously aware of. And actually, when we follow those opportunities or just hints, you know, sometimes people could say, you know, I have to find my purpose and that calling, but sometimes it's just doing something in a different routine. And, you know, like, okay, I went to Afghanistan, like, that's not for everybody, and I don't highly recommend it for my son who was taking photographs, like, that's not the way. But the idea of taking an adventure, and it could be as simple as taking a different route home, but being aware and conscious so that when something enters in that doesn't feel like your habitual idea, and it sparks something in you kind of start to take that thread. Yeah.
And where are they all now? Have
Ooh.
you had any contact with these people?
Not.
Do you know anything about them now?
I found on the internet. I mean, that's the interesting thing too about a memoir with Google. You know. They have, I don't know, you know, not directly. I have no real contact. I did find one of the leaders is still alive. That I did 2 trips in, fairly lengthy trips. And then also I took a journey into the former Soviet Union. But, you know, when I came to write this memoir, I was in such a different place in my life. You know, I had been a journalist, I had been a filmmaker, and then I became a homeopath. And then I was journal writing. I mean, I came into my 50s looking at journal. I was always a journal writer since I was a teenager. And so I started with a friend of mine. We would wake each other up at 6 a.m. and say, okay, let's write. Let's call.
What happened when you said that you went to visit there?
Yeah, so when I was there, I was in the 80s. So your question around like what's happened to these people, I don't know. I mean, it's not, I basically,
You have no contact with any of them? Whether they exist or not?
no, I've had no contact. I mean, I changed most of the names because of the circumstances, and it's a very intimate memoir. I mean, I had affairs with some of the Mujahideen, so in a culture that it's probably, I think they might. There were very few American women, that traveled with them. I hope they're still alive. One of the men I did find was still alive in his village and was now, he's old like, me now, like he's not this young 20-year-old anymore, But I think it's an interesting question about, I know the next book, I know the journey of going back. It's so sad what's happening in that country too. It's, the healing and what what we're trying to do and what we're actually doing are so not I don't know. Go ahead. Sorry.
So, I'm just sort of really fascinated by what you're saying because it's sort of my experience as a result of a very difficult period that our family went through. I think what you're kind of talking about is how when you go through experiences like that, you just start to have a heightened sense of awareness around what's happening around you that most people don't really kind of focus in on in the busyness of life. My daughter said to me the other day, "Dad, the most amazing things always happen to you on your walks." And I said to her, "Well, Ashley, I sort of look at it from a different perspective." I said, things happen on my walks that I receive with an open heart, and then something else happens that helps me appreciate their amazingness.
Yeah.
And I'm just finished reading Liz Gilbert's book Big Magic,
Yeah.
and she talks about that same sort of concept that these things are sort of swirling around us, and they're looking for someone who's sensitive enough to pick up on them and do something with them.
Yeah.
I think it's just, it's really sort of a remarkable way to live. But oftentimes I think it takes sort of an extreme situation to kind of break you out of the normalcy of things, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think you really described it so beautifully. I mean, it's those transition times, even if it's within a day of the
Walk, it's sort of that time when we're in between things, in those pauses. And Jean Houston, I don't know if any of you know about her. She's kind of one of these leaders in the kind of spiritual movement, but also worked for the United Nations and did a lot of work around NGOs and that. And so she would say, we have a live one, like what somebody's been turned on. We're going to grab that live one and send messages, like Elizabeth Gilbert has that same concept, which comes from an ancient Greek concept, that she wrote about. But I think there is that being open to it, and then things will start to come in that are oftentimes don't make sense, or they make sense but they make us go deeper. Yeah.
To take a step back and do that, look back and say, wow, that didn't really make sense at the time, and then to start to see clearly why it made so much sense, given where you are today.
Yeah, and I think that's what journal writing does in a way, when you then add this extra layer of looking at what are the themes. Like I was trying to figure out why I went to a war zone, like
What was it about me that chose that? And then there was a memory where my father was in a very bad fire. He almost died in this fire. And we lived in this very unusual situation in Washington, D.C. It was a time when it was a very dangerous neighborhood. It was considered, D.C. at that time, the murder capital of the United States. I mean, and we were in the kind of epicenter of that kind of a dangerous, my mom had this idea of of gentrification before there was a label for it. So we were in this apartment building that had a stone wall around it, you know. So we were the only kids, like there were three of us. I was the oldest with my sister and my brother, and then there was a single mom with her daughter, and she got appointed to be the Peace Corps director in Senegal. And she said, after this crisis happened with the fire and my father was in the hospital, I was invited to go with her and her daughter to Senegal in the middle of this craziness in my family. And my mother said yes. And so I went in, you know, this incredible time. I was turning 12, or I was like 11, almost 12, and had this exposure of being with these Peace Corps, you know, volunteers in another world, and just I loved it, you know. And I have that kind of travel bug, you know. We're going 10,000 miles, 16 cities, all these bookstores, you know. So it's in me, you know, to love that. And I think what happened was I connected kind of crisis with travel and adventure as a way to kind of, you know, survive a difficult time, or actually enjoy, you know, life at a different level than what was going on with my family. When I came back, things had resolved quite a bit. My father did survive, and, you know, things kind of patched their way back together. So, I mean, again, like you said, like going back through memories and seeing, well, could that have been a critical reason why I felt comfortable going into a foreign country like that in a dangerous place? Yeah.
In such, I guess, an intense place, did you feel when you came back that it was almost a little bit of a lull, that there wasn't that intensity, or did you?
Yeah, I think that's also really interesting. I mean, because I think a lot of war journalists get hooked into
The adrenaline, and they keep.
Twice, you know,
Yeah.
type of thing, and then coming back, did you have any of them?
you know, for me, it was a really different kind of level. First, I was extremely naive. You know, I thought if I just went in, did the news, did the story, you know, like that kind of like just the facts, you know, film that and bring it out, that I would have done my job, right? I mean, that was how, and I didn't understand the country very much or the customs or any of that. I was very naive. And what happened was when I got the footage out, that footage was used in a way that I didn't feel had the integrity. So CBS edited some training footage with the war footage, even the way the New York Times did the article they left out for me, which was the critical story. So I started to understand that news was manipulated for the agenda of the Times. And that, you know, I just was like, wow. So I think that was kind of the shock of like, wow, the reason I went in there, what I thought this field was about. And then when I had the opportunity to go in the second time, I thought, okay, again, I was more experienced, I understood news, but I still thought I could change the world, that I could have this agenda, because I got invited to go with another partner. My husband George actually went in the first time, and I sold his footage to NBC, and that's how I had access to go in myself. And so one of his companions had a story of going and finding Commander Massoud. And Commander Massoud was the mujahideen who was killed just before 9/11 because he had power over the Taliban and was a very critical figure, commander inside the country. Most of the major commanders for the mujahideen were living outside of Afghanistan. And not, you know, so passionate about why they were really fighting for their country in the same way that Commander Massoud was. And so I thought if I could just tell the story, because he had created a ceasefire with the Soviets. And so I thought, okay, if we could get the story out about peace that was happening there, then these, you know, leaders would understand that it's possible to have peace in Afghanistan. Well, BBC did a very nice story about it, a fairly in-depth story. But the United States said it was too complicated. They wanted just bang footage, and, you know, and never broadcasted the footage. So I think at that point, that's when I started to go in even deeper about, okay, what are the stories I want to tell? How do I do that? I was in New York City, and so I started, after the Iraqi invasion, figuring out ways to tell the story of, okay, what are women's lives? What are women's stories? And how do we have that? Because that was before social media, where women really didn't have access at that time to tell your story unless you were a writer and you could get published, or,
there was no mechanism to tell your story and get it out to the public. And so this was a methodology using my independent film skills, and I had partners in a whole community, and so we started to record and videotape, and that eventually became the PBS series, 5 half hours. So I think I think it was more of a healing and following kind of what was my integrity around that. It wasn't just, okay, I did my job, I got my, whatever money I needed, made, or the title, or even some recognition. It was, okay, what is the ultimate meaning of that? And I wasn't happy with the outcome. And so then that led me to other ways to find those connections and those stories.
That here, since it's such a mess, I mean, it's beyond a mess, you know what I mean? And it gets worse. It's not even getting any, you don't even see it. Are you drawn to it, or you're kind of taken away that you've kind of given up and not gotten involved?
Well, going
I don't
on
want to
this
say
journey.
given up, but you know what I mean? In terms
Yeah.
of being more.
I mean, I think because also I was a homeopath, so I mean, I did so many one-on-ones of those kinds of interviews to find out, why. I mean, many of you probably have no idea what is homeopathy, which totally makes sense. Why? Because it's probably the least known of all these medical modalities. It's a talking therapy in the sense that the case is taken through a dialogue in an interview, and it's pattern matching. So what happens is, when you do an interview in homeopathy, you look at what's
unique in that person. So for example, if somebody has migraines, and then what I want to know is, like, what makes it worse and better, and what kind of migraine? Does it feel like you're being attacked from the back, and it's, like this, ice pick, coming at you, or and all these kind of unique sensations or experiences is what I'm listening for as a homeopath. And then I pattern match that with a remedy that has that same kind of experience with what we call provers. So provers take that remedy and they start to tell these same kind of symptoms, sensations, dreams. I mean, it's a huge amount of data that comes out of provings, and we pattern match that with those remedies. And so I think what happened was, after being a journalist and a filmmaker and becoming a healer and then teaching that, was looking at, okay, where do we really need change in the world? And I saw it at an individual level, that we need to, in ourselves, change, and then take that out into the world. And so now I'm kind of coming out into the world of, okay, where are we in society? Like, what's happening in Miami? Like, what are the places, like, your experience of bringing that ripples out to all the people close to you. And that affects them, which then brings people in. And I think that's where change is going to happen in the really sort of, maybe it takes a few generations, but that's where I'm sort of treading.
Survive. Where is it now, and what's happening there now?
Yeah, so I was in, I did look up, one of the things with, going back and Googling is that it was possible to find this village. This particular village was restored. It was an art village. It was where a lot of crafts were made, from pottery to jewelry to even sheepskin type of clothing, vests, and they did manage to get some funds. The Taliban wiped it out. The Soviets never wiped out that village, actually.
And now it's under the control of the Afghan government? Where is it now?
I mean, these things right now, from my understanding, it's very, there's no stability. So
It's
depending
like
on
no
what's...
man's land, or?
No. This village that I found, this commander, I mean, it's a tribal culture. So you have these alliances that happen on a tribal level, and those are in villages, and and then you have the cities where people are refugees who are just trying to survive. So there's, obviously, it's not as
So
housed.
it's closest to which big city now, that village?
Well, this one is,
Where is it more
I
or less
mean,
in Afghanistan?
yeah, I mean, I was in the Kandahar region. I spent the first trip in there, which is much more flat and desert-like. And at that time when I went, after the Soviets invaded, was pretty destroyed already. Then I went up into the northern part, into the Panjshir Valley, where it looks more like Colorado. 14,000 is the beginning of the Hindu Kush Mountains. At that time, it was more protected. But I mean, things still happen. So this village that was there, it's outside of Kabul. It was a very a place people went for holidays, you know, like the Prince, and that managed to rebuild itself. That's all I know from seeing it on the internet. But I don't know how stable these things are.
And how can you
know?
find if somebody's survived and is still there?
Yeah.
You look him up in a telephone book?
I saw him.
Oh, you really? But how? Through the internet?
Yeah, there were photographs.
Wow.
And the interesting thing was, you know, like I had a experience with memories. Like people ask, well, how do you remember from memoirs, right? I mean, and I think those of us who've written memoirs or gone back through memories, it's like you drop into that time and space, which it needs a kind of holding space. And what I found was I'm a more visual person, and one of the memories was I saw roses in Peshawar, which is on the border of Pakistan, and was one of the cities or before going into Afghanistan. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense. It's so dry there, like everything. But I really saw roses, so I Googled roses.
You know, plus Peshawar, right? I mean, how would, and all of a sudden I saw all these poems written about the roses of Peshawar and songs, and what had happened was the British who had, you know, come into that area had planted so many roses that it actually was a kind of haven of roses in a much, you know, of a desert kind of town. So I think those are the things that, you know, are to trust. Some of those memories, of course, we know from science not to trust most of our memories either, you know, but do they hold meaning? I mean, I think that's the question when we go back and look at our lives, like what are those benchmarks? And can we see the patterns, like a homeopath, like what are they and what are those themes? And so this is my first, I've written a second memoir about becoming a mother and being in my 30s and learning about homeopathy and the magic of it, because homeopathy is magical. It has some really wild things, to the point that an editor said you can't write that because I gave a homeopathic remedy when somebody died in Abidjan in Brazil. I don't know if some of you know of John of God. He does these like crazy psychic healings, and he travels now to the United States. And so this man died in front of me, and I was a homeopathic student, so I thought, okay, you know, he just tripped and fell. So I ran and got my homeopathic kit. I was really new to homeopathy. I mean, I studied a little bit. And then I opened the kit, and the doctor there pronounced him dead. And there's a homeopathic remedy called Carbo-Veg that's the keynote. So we have remedies that have keynotes that says it brings the, you know, the dead back alive. So, you know, I put the pellets in his mouth, and he, you know, started breathing again. And I ended up with that entourage, you know, and he died a few hours later. But, you know, I was like, oh my God, this is really unbelievable medicine. And so the second book is about that. And the third one I'm in the process of writing is about sort of male-female relationships and where they work or don't work, and that kind of tension and sort of connection. And yeah.
So I'm an aspiring writer also.
Oh, great.
And I really love politics, and so I know that it can sometimes be easy for your emotions to get attached to the story that you're assigned to. And when you were in Afghanistan, at what point did you feel that your emotions were getting a part of your story? And what advice would you have for someone who writes to kind of like not let that get in the way of the story that you're trying to tell?
Yeah, so that's interesting because I wrestled with that. I mean, now that I'm 54 and I would use the emotions. I mean, that's where I think the heroine's journey, I think this idea of being the unbiased journalist is complete crock. You know, I mean, whether you don't state your biasness.
Right? I mean, I think it's ridiculous. I mean, everybody has an agenda and everybody has a political viewpoint, and to not put it in there in our transparent way, I think that might be the future of journalism, is more of this authentic transparency. And people connect to it more. Honestly, I mean, the news flies by. It's oftentimes a repeat of whatever happened before or will come later. What really connects is stories. And so I think for me, memoirs or these personal stories are our new myths. Like we need these stories of what is sort of modern lives. And looking back at the Greeks, I mean, my husband's Greek, and you know, I totally identify with these archetypes and these myths, but we need new myths. And when their direct experiences, especially like a journalist, is called into heightened places, circumstances, or has that lens, because they've chosen that. They have that, you have that intention when you go in to find the story, to find, and really, I think this is one of those places where you have to feel like, okay, what works for you? Obviously, some, publications are going to require a certain kind of structure, and that's okay. But to be aware that, can you ever really be unbiased? And I thought I could, so I totally identify. I was that. I thought, okay, just the facts, Yeah, I think it's a great question. Any other ideas, questions? Yeah.
What is your biggest surprise from these presentations as to how people react to your story? And so on?
The biggest is that the men have been telling their stories. And I didn't expect that. I really thought of this as, kind of because it's a woman's, vision, story, life. And the men have been coming, which is also, in small, kind of intimate. And usually it's the men that are digging deep to tell their heartfelt stories. And the women, in my experience, are actually like the fact that it's a guy telling that. That it kind of, it's fresh. And so one of the stories that happened very early on, I was in Washington, D.C., and there was a guy in the back, and he seemed like he wasn't connecting, and the dialogue was happening, and at the end he said, my mother, first of all he said, is grieving part of the heroine's journey? And I said, of course, right? That's the heart, that's the emotions. And he said, my mother had died a couple months before, and it was under difficult circumstances. He was living in one of the countries in the Middle East where they didn't know what was happening, they didn't diagnose properly, so they went and took her and brought her back to DC, and it turned out she was dying, and she died shortly after. And they had the experience of the hospice coming in and supporting them. And so after her death, he had this calling, this feeling that he wanted to take hospice to people in his country, and so that they could have that experience and support and all that. And he was like, his family was like, are you crazy? Like, that's such a, how are you going to get the money for that? And what are you thinking? And he was saying, but for him, he was just, making those kind of connections, that was his heroine's journey of feeling like he could, he had that need to do that. And now he had a label for it, So I think that's a great question of like, where have those moments sort of like giving people ways to dialogue. Like my hope is, okay, now you go out. Like another person came and she was working with me, so she's been hearing all these ideas, and but she brought her husband, who was a British guy, who didn't say anything. But she said, after we left, he had so many questions and wanted to talk about that side of himself, that I think she sort of said, because it has this war aspect, kind of allows it easier to kind of go deeper. So that's a great question. So that's what's been interesting, to see that kind of coming together of those two qualities, and both being able to share. And it takes a lot of courage to do that, actually. Maybe some of you know each other, but as a group, we don't have a safe space in the usual sense. And yet these kind of essence of what really matters have been coming up in just, so that's been the best part, really, to see that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Folks, of course, we have the books for sale behind the counter if you'd like to purchase a copy. Melissa will be sitting right here signing. If you're watching online, give us a call. We'll get one signed for you. Can we get another round of applause for our author? That was a wonderful, very astute presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Just stick around. We've got live music. We've got our bar out there. We got our food. No better place to be on a Good Friday than here at Books and Books. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.